If you needed proof that Motorola's mid-range Moto G phones are a big deal, how about this? The company is profitable and has been for a couple quarters because of those phones, but they've also used device lines like the Moto 1 family to just try new and interesting stuff, and this time, we're kind of seeing something a little different. We're seeing the ingenuity and the experimentation that goes with that Moto 1 line making its way into these new Moto G devices, the Moto G Stylus and the Moto G Power. Let's take a closer look. Right off the bat, I have to say, these are very similar devices in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to the shared foundation that they both have. They both use, for example, the Snapdragon 665 chipset with 4 gigs of RAM, and they're remarkably snappy, sort of given these limited chipsets. These are far from flagship devices, but they work perfectly well. At least they did in the little bit of hands-on time we've had here in Chicago. They also both have 6.4-inch Full HD Plus displays, which are probably one of the weaker links in these devices. For devices like the Moto G's, smart compromise has always kind of been the name of the game, and we're not seeing Motorola really invest in crazy screens in these things, but they also don't really need them. They look nice enough. I do think the Power is the slightly less interesting of the two, if only because it doesn't aspire to nearly as much. The Power in its name refers simply to the 5,000 milliamp hour battery inside the phone, which is rated for about 3 days of use, a claim that we have not been able to fully test, having only used this thing for about 35 minutes. That is actually a lot of battery though, especially when you consider this is a $250 phone. This is a pretty value-focused device, so getting multi-day battery life out of it, that's definitely something to write home about. The cameras are perfectly passable. We did a bit of testing here. You're gonna be spending most of your time with a 16 megapixel wide sensor. There is also an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera that captures up to 118 degrees of what's in front of you, and that's roughly analogous to what you see with the human eye. So you're getting a full sense of what's going on in your frame. And there is also a macro sensor, which is actually kind of cool, but of very dubious value, I would say. It's a 2 megapixel sensor, so don't expect tremendously detailed, beautiful photos right out of the gate. But if you really wanted to see what a quarter looked like up close, or a random bit of gadgetry you happen to have laying around the house, it is actually pretty good for that. Motorola says it's trying to sort of redefine what people expect, what normal means to mid-range smartphones like this, and if this is the path they're choosing, I don't know that it's the right one, but it's definitely not a bad addition. I do have to say though, I'm a little bit more taken by the Moto G Stylus, which again uses a lot of the same components as the Moto G Power, but adds, obviously, a stylus. And yeah, this is a pretty thin, pretty unassuming stylus. It's definitely not Galaxy Note level. There's no Wacom digitizer here. There's no Bluetooth. You can't use it as a remote. It very much is a tiny metal stick with a little metal mesh on the end that you use to write on the screen. But writing on the screen does give you a couple extra options. You are able to, for example, edit cinematograms, select portions of the screen to animate, and just sort of get in there and be a little bit more productive while writing in your Word documents. I don't know. I personally don't use styluses very much at all, but if you had to have one, you get one in the $300 package, which is kind of not nothing. The only other device that you'll see out there even close is LG's Stylo family, and those are pretty compromised devices. So if you somehow really like the idea of writing on your smartphone, you could do a lot worse than this thing. Now this phone only costs $50 more than the Moto G Power, and for me it kind of feels like that premium is well worth it. You're getting 128 gigs of storage right out of the box compared to the 64 that you get in the Moto G Power. The camera is a pretty big improvement here too. There's a 48 megapixel main sensor, which you'll spend a lot of your time on, and that bins down to 12 megapixel still shots, and in my experience they're not gonna set your house on fire, but they are pretty nice to look at. Beyond that, we also have the same action camera setup that we saw in the Moto 1 action from last year, and if you forgot what that's like, it's the weird thing where you can hold your phone vertically and shoot horizontal video, because who hasn't been to a concert and shot bad video because it's all vertical? Who wants to look at that? Oh, and again, there's that same 2 megapixel macro camera, which I don't need, but I don't mind, actually. It's pretty fun to play with, even though it never really transcends its static as a gimmick. At the end of the day, these are very reasonably priced phones, and they have spec sheets and experiences that kind of belie what you would expect from this kind of price tag. What do you expect? It's Motorola. It's a mid-range phone. This is exactly where they want to be, and this is exactly the kind of thing that's brought them success in the past. There are rumors that Motorola is working on a flagship device, so maybe Motorola will broaden its horizons in the near future, but for now, if they keep just making pretty solid, pretty inexpensive mid-range phones like these, I'm perfectly happy.